Good evening. Welcome back to Paranormal M. Help us work the algorithm by dropping a comment below, respond to stories, or leave your own 6 cents on the matter. It helps us a lot to grow our channel and keep us going. So, enjoy the ride. Something that's bothered me since I was a kid. In the 90s, I was in my younger years, you could say. I remembered this day specifically for 2 reasons. One, I'd finally saved enough pocket money to go get hungry hippos. And 2, what I'm about to tell you. So it was a warm and sunny day, sometime in the late 90s. I'd finally saved enough money to get hungry hippos. My mom was talking me to get it soon. She said that she had to do some ironing. So I followed her upstairs and I sat on her bed, waffling nonsense as most kids do, when the house phone rings downstairs. Mental, I know. Telephone's attached to the wall. Christ, I'm old. So am I. So she puts the iron down and goes downstairs. I'm sat there yammering away to myself when I looked to the left, and there was a black shadow-like figure, quite tall with red eyes, looking at me through the bedroom window. I absolutely shit a brick. Got goosebumps typing this out. So I jumped underneath my mom's quilt on her bed and waited for her to come back upstairs, absolutely sweating my back out. She came up and it was like nothing had happened. I'm still quite confused about this to this day, and I've just turned 30. It was so clear, though. I could clearly see it just staring at me. I will say as well, the house that we were in was originally incredibly haunted. I've got many a story from being a child, but this is one of the ones that lingers. Something strange happened to me, and I'm looking for answers. Not safe for work warning. You've been warned. I had something that's been bothering me, and it happened recently. To start off, I look for any possible explanations and everything, but I'm not really finding one here. 2 nights ago, I was sleeping when I heard my best friend's voice talking to me, and it woke me up. As soon as I heard her, I immediately woke up and I looked at the corner of the room where I saw a figure. Since I was half asleep, I assumed it was her because I had heard her voice wake me up just seconds before. I flat out asked it my name twice. I'm gonna change her name and I'm gonna change it to Sam. So, Sam? When I asked whatever I saw, if it was my best friend by name, it started to disappear. At that time, I assumed maybe my eyes were just adjusting and I was still pretty tired and went back to bed. When I woke up in the morning, I started thinking about how weird it really was, so I decided to tell my brother about it. As I'm telling my brother, both our front door and screen door opened and shut like somebody was coming in. Mind you, they were completely shut moments before. We both looked at each other and was like, yeah, that was definitely weird just now. I decided to sleep with my lamps on at night just because I was a little spooked. At one point, I woke up to use the bathroom and I realized my lamp was turned off, even though I had specifically left it on. I was also the last one awake, so no one came in here and turned it off after I fell asleep, as if they were already asleep themselves. This one can be explained, though, as it might have turned the lamp off, or maybe I might have turned the lamp off and not remembered. However, it's still weird when taking everything else into account. Back to what originally started this, the figure. This is driving me absolutely nuts, because at the moment it didn't occur to me how weird it would have been for my best friend to be standing in the corner watching me sleep, and instead, I accepted it as normal and even asked if it was her. And here's the thing. It wasn't because it didn't even look like her, it was simply a figure. Just a dark figure with barely any characteristics. When I asked the figure if it was the name of my friend, I was filled with an unsettling feeling of split-second fear. For the slight second in that moment, I was scared that when I asked if it was my friend, it was going to step out and reveal itself as something else. But instead, it started disappearing. Phew. Weird encounter in California. A little bit of background. I was driving from Washington to California in 2021 to visit my grandfather. I had a little red Honda with 200,000 plus miles on her. Good little car. Anyways, I'm driving through one of the national forests in the late night hour looking for a place to park my car and sleep. I was pretty low on cash, so I figured almost anything would work. I see a sign that looks perfect. Campground up ahead to the right half-mile. I turn down the first right turn that I come across and make my way down the road. It's a really rough road, but I figure some campgrounds work like that. Go about a mile down the road and realize this is probably not the campground road, but a logging road or something. There's a small clearing to the left of the roadway, and I figured it was just as good as anything else. So I parked my car and killed the lights. I had left my blankets and pillow in the trunk of my car, so I got out to retrieve them. I noticed that I can hear my heart beating regularly, loudly, and I don't question it. I continued collecting my things, and a thought ran across my mind. That's not my heartbeat. I don't know what I was hearing, but my mind flooded with fear and adrenaline, and I got back into my car as fast as I could. Scared at first, I just listened because I thought the heartbeat could have been footsteps from a very large something. Then I got the idea to turn on my headlights. I could see nothing around, hear nothing around. The headlights were facing the opposite way of the direction I assumed the noise to be coming from. But with brake lights on, I saw nothing. Well, I started to wonder whether I had heard anything at all. I had blanket and pillow, shut off car, and was so tired I decided to try and lay down. This lasted less than 2 minutes. All of my senses were telling me to leave, so I did. Made it back to the highway, took a right turn back onto it, and found the campground shortly after. This part has nothing to do with the story, other than being what happened between when I went back to see if I could find footprints. When I reached the campground, there was a group partying that started shouting at me and asking if I was Roy. They were loud and sounded to be having a good time. I said no, but they couldn't really hear me, so I just drove a bit further and found a place to sleep. After trying to sleep for a bit, but the noise being loud, I had tried just walking up to hang out with them, but got scared and went back to the car. Fell asleep and go back the next day to the clearing on whatever road to see if I could find footprints. Nothing. No heartbeat sound. A ghost led me to my family tomb. This happened in early July. I was on a trip with my wife and mother-in-law through the United Kingdom, and we had a few days in Edinburgh to take in the sights. Now I knew that my family was originally from Scotland, but I wasn't sure where. Edinburgh seemed a pretty safe bet though, since that's where J.K. Rowling is from, and my last name, while rather uncommon, is incredibly similar to a minor character in the Harry Potter books. We had heard that she took inspiration for a number of characters' names from headstones that she found in local kirkyards, cemeteries. So we decided to take a look for ourselves to see if we could find anything. Long story short, we did. Early one evening, we visited St. Cuthbert's St. Cuthbert's kirkyard near Edinburgh Castle. By random chance, we arrived just as the paranormal bus tour was leaving. The tour group were all lined up by the bus, but the tour guide was walking alone through the kirkyard to meet them. Clearly not one to miss the opportunity to spook some out-of-towners as we crossed paths. He told us to be on the lookout for a little ghost of a little 6-year-old. He said she likes to tug on people's jackets, which we took as an opportunity to make a few predictable jokes to scare each other once we were on our own. So we walked around the graveyard for a bit, talking about the various names that we saw, and I made a point to mention that if we did see any of my ancestors, the spelling might be different. After some time, I felt a small hand hold mine. My wife has pretty small hands, but she was standing to the other side of me, and this was smaller, childlike. There was no chill in the air, no eerie feeling that I was being watched, just a small child's hand reaching out and holding onto mine. I didn't say anything out loud because my mother-in-law is very religious, and I'm already on thin ice with her over some of my political stances, so it seemed best to keep my mouth shut about an ongoing paranormal encounter. So there I was, walking through a graveyard with my wife on my left, my mother-in-law behind me, and an invisible child holding my hand as we looked at the tombstones. I was completely silent. I wasn't afraid, though. This ghost seemed kind of friendly, and people say I have kid magic, so I figured, hey, this kid probably just wanted to hold my hand and take a stroll. It wouldn't be so out of the ordinary had the child in question been somebody I knew and, well, alive, but I digress. I slowed my pace to make it easier for the kid to keep up. I have long legs and people say I walk fast, which caused me to fall behind a little as my wife went on ahead. Mother-in-law was reading the headstones carefully, causing her to fall even further behind. And I realized I didn't want to split up our group, so I looked ahead and called out to my wife. I was going to walk over to her, but the hand pulled back on me. I kept my eyes on my wife and told her to wait up for us, and the hand started tugging towards the right side of the path, slightly behind me. It wasn't violent. It felt more like a kid trying to get me to look at something. I was still facing forward when I heard my mother-in-law's voice from behind me on the right side of the path. "Is this what you're looking for?" I turned around, and sure enough, she was standing in front of a large headstone engraved with my family name. About a dozen of my ancestors were directly beneath us, and a ghostly child's hand was trying to show me where they were. I paused and took in the experience. It was incredible, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. After spending some time there, the grip on my hand loosened slightly, but it didn't let go. We continued on our journey and found myself swinging my right arm involuntarily to a slightly different rhythm than my own stride. If you've ever held hands with a small child while they're skipping rather than walking, you know what this kind of feels like. After a short walk, though, the swinging stopped, and I felt my hand released. There was a slight brushing feeling as the spectral hand took leave of my own, and when I looked in the direction that it might lead, I saw I was standing in front of the grave with the girl's name. She died at 6 years old in the early 19th century. For the life of me, I can't remember the name on that headstone, but if I saw it, I would know it right away. And if I ever return to Edinburgh, I'll make sure to bring her flowers to thank her for showing me around. My childhood home. My family lived in this home from the mid-70s into the 90s. The house always had a creepy feel to my brother and I. So many strange things happened there. Toilets flushing at night, stereo coming on. My brother and I were terrified of the basement for some reason. My mom would send us down there to get a loaf of bread out of the freezer, and you never saw a kid race up and down stairs quicker. Nothing unusual happened in the house according to the oldest members of the neighborhood. One Saturday morning, I got my bowl of Fruit Loops and plopped down in front of the TV to watch Bugs Bunny. Everyone else was asleep. I could hear the chair that was 12 feet behind me moving. It was a regular 1970s living room chair, but it was on a base that allowed it to swivel side to side or rock back and forth. I assumed my cat had just jumped up to sit in the chair, as he often did. But moments later, my cat came in and sat by me, and the chair kept rocking. A few spoonfuls of cereal later, and it was rocking so hard I could tell the wooden base was coming off the floor. My brother and I had done that from time to time because we were dorks. I was too scared to turn around to look at it. Oddly enough, the night before, my family and I watched a 60-minute special about a haunted house. The people told the ghost that they wanted to be friends with it. Then the scary interactions stopped, and there were only a few mischievous events after that. So I repeated their speech as best as I could remember it. The chair stopped moving. I went back to bed, still not looking at the chair, and tried to go back to sleep. All the strange events stopped, but the house never lost the creepy vibe. Haunted building in Denver. This is my dad's story from the late 1970s, but I'll write it out as if I'm him. I've heard the story so many times it's easier to just transcribe it from memory instead of retelling it, if that makes sense. I worked for a building maintenance company, HVAC, plumbing, electrical. We had a customer with a problem building in downtown Denver that had chronic intermittent issues. I'm pretty sure the building goes by the name of the XYZ building, but he can't remember the name now. Only that it was right across from the Denver Mint and next to a hotel. We had been called out to this building 3 days in a row that week and couldn't make a repair because it was always fine when we were there. I can't remember what this problem was, but it's immaterial to the story. This customer was really putting pressure on my boss that we had to fix whatever the problem was immediately. And the boss was mad that he couldn't bill anything out yet, so we decided to let the three of us who ran the unproductive service calls there and just spend the night there to figure it out. Great. The building engineer was always a crazy son of a bitch. The man had his way of fixing things and we had ours. He used very crude materials, and he had horrible workmanship on his fixes. We fixed things the proper way so that everything was up to code. Needless to say, it was usually his repairs that failed. For example, I was called out once to fix an ice machine. I found it was rigged with rubber bands and paper clips when the thermostat needed to be replaced. The building manager asked me if I found the problem, so I showed him how I found the machine and explained how it should be fixed. The building engineer also showed up, yelling. I told them it wouldn't work. They're always doing these shoddy repairs. They should be fired. When we got to the building for our overnight adventure, a maintenance worker told us that the engineer had died at his desk in the mechanical room a few days before. We were a little relieved to hear that we wouldn't have to deal with the bastard. We got to the mechanical room, set up our cots to prepare for the night, and double-checked that we all brought our tools in with us, because we were going to be locked in for the night. We were sitting there joking around about what we expected to find wrong with the building, and one of the guys noticed the building's engineer's sweater was still in its usual place over the back of his chair. The guys working with me absolutely hated him and threw the sweater on the ground and stomped on it because the building engineer was always such a jerk. Shortly after that, we were making rounds and all the electrical to the building went out. Yet, against all logic, we noticed the elevators were somehow in use. We could tell the elevator was a couple of floors above us by looking at the floor indicator. I'm thinking this was some kind of open floor plan, multi-floor department store office at the time. When the doors opened, we heard the elevator settle a bit, like a significant weight just got into the elevator. It went down a floor, still a floor above us, and we heard the doors open, and it sounded like a single person got off the elevator, walked a few paces in the store office, and got back into the elevator. Our floor was next, and we assumed people were up to no good, ended up locking the building with us. So we ran back to the mechanical rooms, that way we could grab something to defend ourselves with. I grabbed my .22 that I always kept in my tool bag, and the two other guys with me grabbed knives or big wrenches, not sure which. On our way back to the spot by the elevators, pipes just started bursting everywhere. I ran to find the main shutoff valve, and after I turned it off, I was back at the spot where we stood before the pipes burst. I looked around for the broken pipes. We found 2 broken peoples down 2 different corridors. Shortly after I finished welding mine, I believe that they autocorrected pipes to peoples, so I'm going to rephrase that. We found 2 broken pipes down 2 different corridors. Shortly after I finished welding mine, the plumber yelled, "Damn it, Jim, I told you to stop messing around." Then I saw the guy running towards me, pale as a ghost. He asked if I had just grabbed his leg when he was on the ladder. I hadn't, nor had the other guy that was with us. The welder said that he figured out when he turned around after welding the pipe where it had broken. He waved his torch and didn't see anyone else in the corridor with him. That was enough for the 2 guys who were working with me. They unlocked the doors and left. They were nephews of my boss, so they could do things like that and not really worry about losing their jobs. I wasn't related to the boss and had to support a whole family, so I locked the doors behind them again and went back to the mechanical room to get some rest if possible. As I laid on my cot with my .22, I heard the elevators going up and down all night long, but way faster than a normal elevator. I could hear what sounded like people running on the floor above me. I planned to just stay in the mechanical room hidden in the basement until the morning when the manager came in. Then I could go home. I noticed it felt a little chilly in the mechanical room, so I checked out the boiler. Definitely cold. The pilot light was out. I didn't smell a bunch of gas, so I just struck a match and relit it. The entire boiler exploded. I ended up with severe burns to my face and arms and never went in that building again. My addition to the story that we lived in Colorado Springs at the time. We knew my dad was working overnight in Denver and expected to see him first thing the next morning. His boss brought him home the next afternoon, and both of his arms and his face were covered in white bandages. That morning, I drew a picture that I said was of my dad, with white, fluffy arms. Singapore Ghost Stories, Chalet Incident. This incident took place recently in 2023 when I stayed in a chalet with my family for one night. This chalet is not in Shanghai or Pasir Ris and nowhere near the east side of Singapore. Not going to disclose the location either. There were a few villas that we could choose, but we picked just the normal villa since it's just for one night. We reached there around 1 p.m., and to be honest, I already felt weird. The villa that was given to us was far from the other villas, and it was beside this forested area. For some weird reason, my grandma immediately said this when we arrived. If anything you see or hear, don't say anything. Even though it was weird to me, it sort of was normal for a Malay or Malay families to say this because we don't want to attract the attention of those things. We started to decorate the chalet for my sister's birthday party, setting up the balloons and unpacking our things. At about 4 p.m., some of our cousins started coming for the party, and my mom realized that we don't have enough ice for all the guests. So I was asked to go to the nearby supermarket to buy ice. When I was leaving the chalet, I have to walk out through the car park, and there was this man standing there, just looking at my villa. I didn't have any thoughts, so I just walked towards him since I have to walk past him to leave the compound. When I walked past him, he asked whether my family's staying there and just nodded. He said to me, "Be careful, huh?" This place, quite active, if you know what I mean, especially your villa. I got creeped out, so I faked a smile and made my way. When I came back with ice packs, I noticed the man is now looking into the bushes behind our villa. He was just acting weird, but still, I chose to ignore him. We had a total of 15 to 20 people in there around 7 p.m., and everybody was having fun. Nothing scary or whatever. That's when the same man appeared again. I was at the barbecue with one of my cousins while the rest of our relatives were inside enjoying the air conditioner and chit-chatting. He approached us at the barbecue and said, "Don't stay outside for too long. There's a grave here." Our reaction was like, what the fuck? We just thought that he was a psycho and chose to join the family inside just to be safe, you know? Still nothing happened, and all the guests went home at around 12 a.m. My grandma, parents, and siblings have already washed up by 12:30 a.m., and I was the last one since I was still eating and catering food. I totally forgot about the psycho guy and was eating alone outside near the barbecue pit now. That's when the disturbances start. I heard someone calling me in the bushes that the man was pointing out. Psst, psst. Initially I ignored it, but suddenly I heard a faint cry from that same direction. This was my last straw, and I ran up to the bedroom to sleep without even washing up. Thankfully, nothing else happened to me that night. But when we reached home, that was when everyone started sharing their experience. Firstly, my grandma said that she saw a woman staring at us in the forested area when we first reached. That's the reason that she said what she said. She described the woman as a faceless being. My mom then said that when she was showering, she heard the same faint cry as me at the point of the same timing. Nothing happened to my siblings, but my dad shared that when he went to smoke near the forested area, he constantly felt somebody caressing his hair, and when he left, he heard somebody calling out his name. After that day, my family and I decided that we are no longer going to book that chalet anymore. The first and the last. Do you know where this place is? Singapore Ghost Story 2. From 2010 to 2014, I lived in this house in West Street 42. I'm not going to name the block, but it was located near a supermarket. Throughout those 4 years, I had always felt uneasy living there. The houses there were quite old. I lived on the 6th floor, and getting home was complicated. Back then, the lifts in my house only stopped at levels 4 and 7. Hence, in order to get home, I had to walk a long corridor and go one level down to reach home. At night, I could say at least 80% of the time there were faulty lights along the corridor at level 7. Walking along the corridor never felt good. You know those types of chills that you get? I always felt cold and my hair would stand on each time I'd walk through that corridor. That's the reason why I run along the corridor most of the time, especially at night. I always feel like somebody's following me from the back all the time. Now here come the hauntings that my family and I faced. I faced 2 incidents back at that old house. One incident happened when I came back home from school and I was alone at home. I was preparing for my PSLE at that time and alone at home around 4 p.m. When I was revising, the earpiece I hung on one end of the wall hooks started untangling on its own at a very high speed before falling onto the floor. No questions asked, I ran straight to my grandparents' house. The second incident happened when I was eating in the kitchen with my helper. We were eating and she asked me whether I felt weird about the house. This was around 7 p.m. when she asked that question the microwave immediately flew open on its own. I forgot what happened next, but we shifted 2 to 3 months after these incidents. After we moved, my dad said that he didn't feel anything in that old house. But my mom told us her stories. Throughout the years, she frequently sees a hand waving at her from the kitchen window, like just an arm waving. We lived on the 6th floor, so there was no way anybody could have waved at my mom. She also complained about the feeling of being followed at level 7. When we told her grandma this, she told us that she knew something about that apartment, but she didn't want to tell us so that we don't, become too scared of living there. She said that when she came out of the lift at level 7, she always would see this dark figure waiting at the corner, and that dark figure will always follow anyone back to their house. Sometimes this figure will follow all the way into the house, and sometimes it'll just follow back to the doorstep and leave us alone. I'm just thankful that I didn't see anything there except for the small disturbance, but for sure I wouldn't want to go back to that house. My friend actually runs a blog that shares ghost stories from Singapore, and since I'm not allowed to promote here, you could check out my profile and leave me a message if you're interested to know more. Singapore Canal, Hungry Ghost Month. This incident took place a few years ago when I was still in primary school. Back then, my family and I were still living in one of the, apartments in the West. There was a large canal behind our HDB block, and there's a secondary school. I believed it's already merged with another secondary school near my block. Since it's the Hungry Ghost Festival now, I thought it would be perfect timing to share this story as it took place during the Hungry Ghost Month. Since I was young, my family made it a point to prepare offerings during the Ghost Month, and we always prepare the offerings facing the canal. After doing what we were told, my siblings and I loved playing at the canal area where we play catch and sometimes spot fishes. Although we couldn't really see any, we did it anyway. Over the years, nothing much happened until something happened eventually. As usual, we started playing after placing the offerings, and since I was already older, I knew about a lot more things. I read somewhere that you could see ghosts when you look in between your legs, which is a common Asian belief. I didn't know what I was thinking, but I thought that it would be the best situation to try out this myth. I took a deep breath and decided to do it. I spread my legs apart and looked in between it. My view was the offerings that were placed earlier, but I didn't see anything. In my mind, I thought to myself, my parents are liars. Why are there no ghosts? Although I didn't see anything, little did I know I have influenced my younger brother. The next thing I saw was my younger brother mimicking my actions while giggling to himself. Since nothing happened to me, I thought it would be the same for him, but I was wrong. His giggling turned to a loud cry. He started shouting, "Booyah!" repeatedly while crying, which translates to, "I don't want." As soon as he started crying, all the candlelights faded, even though there was no wind. As usual, I was laughing because my young, dumb mind thought that he was joking. Not long later, my parents came and I got an ass whooping for influencing my younger brother. After much consoling done by my parents, my little brother opened up to us. He said that it was crowded and there were many people squatting. What I remember was him describing a large group of people squatting around the offerings and began moving towards him when he looked in between his legs. After hearing that, I couldn't sleep the whole night because I was scared that those things followed us home and was watching me sleep. Although nothing paranormal happened that night, my parents brought us to the temple to cleanse ourselves and get rid of any negative energy. I moved a few years later and saw some articles claiming that the area is supposedly haunted. Maybe that's the reason why I had the chills at the time when I was there, but thankfully, nothing happened to me. Singapore Night Safari Ghost Story. This incident happened to myself back in 2010 or 2009, if I remember correctly. Back then, the Night Safari had a Halloween special, and in my opinion, it is way scarier than the Halloween Horror Nights in the US. We had many decorations from hanging haunted dolls, Chinese zombies, realistic tombstones, and many more. The main theme was spooky tales of Asia, or something along those lines. I was working there back then, and there were many ghost encounters that were reported to us, the staff. The reason I say reported is because many of the guests do not know that they actually encountered something. Here's some of the stories. Firstly, my personal encounter with the supposedly realistic Pontianak. Back then, I was one of the staff roaming around the compound near the boardwalk. I found what it was, and it was called, but it was something along those lines. When I was there, I frequently received this compliment that the decorations on the trees look realistic. Initially, I just smiled and nodded to them for compliments, but suddenly I thought to myself, what is this decoration that so many people are attracted to? After about 4 to 5 compliments, I was approached by this couple. I'm not sure whether they're Japanese or Korean. They said to me in English, though, "The flying lady, very good." That's when I realized that it was not any of the decorations. There was no flying lady involved at all, and in my mind, I immediately thought of the Pontianak. I wasn't really scared since there were a lot of people there, but I definitely had the chills being in that area. The second story happened to one of my friends who was working at the train attraction. If I'm not wrong, it's called Train of Horror during the Halloween event. What she experienced was similar to me, but it's way scarier. She was one of the scare actors there, and as usual, they will naturally start jump scaring the guests. The creeps started coming when one of the tourists on the train said to his friend, "These two are by far the scariest ghosts we've seen this ride." She thought to herself, "These two?" She was alone in there the whole time, and at first she believed that the tourists were playing a trick on her. Slowly, she realized that some of the tourists were recording something else each time they passed her zone. Instead of pointing the camera to her, they were pointing it to the area behind her. The last story is a famous one, but I just thought of sharing it since it's one of the more creepy ones. No one told me this story specifically, but I managed to eavesdrop the conversation between the other staffs. They were making jokes about how some of the scare actors were really into their role, and one of them even decided to sit on top of the tram. However, none of them did. The drivers insisted that they clearly saw someone sitting, but no one admitted to it. Or maybe there was actually no one there. Old Boon Lay Disturbance. Recently, I came to know that Boon Lay is a famous place for ghost stories. Being a huge fan of the paranormal, I read a lot of stories and listened to a lot of horror podcasts. That's when I came upon the story that claimed Boon Lay to be a paradise for ghosts. And the reason for this is that many of those who practiced black magic left their things there when they shifted, meaning they moved. I guess this explains my encounters back when I was staying there. My family and I used to stay in Boon Lay way back, and now Boon Lay looks better with the new blocks and other infrastructure. Back then, the whole atmosphere actually felt gloomy. No offense, some of the people there seemed a bit peculiar as well, especially those living in the old apartments opposite the church. When I was young, around the age of 7 or 8, my parents were strict on curfew timing. I must be back before 7 p.m. no matter what, and if there's any instance that I have to go back past 7 p.m., one of my parents will fetch me. This was due to a few stories that were famous back then in my neighborhood. The stories included paranormal sightings, and a majority of it was just talking about bomos and witches that were living in my area. At my age, I didn't know what all that meant, but I still followed the given curfew. Even though I was obedient, I remembered having a few disturbances. In one instance, I was home alone that night for about 1 hour since my parents went to buy groceries. I don't know what went on in my parents' mind since they already knew about those stories. The windows in my room was facing the corridor on the 4th floor, and since I was a scaredy cat, I kept it closed 90% of the time. While I was watching TV, I heard shuffling noise outside the corridor. The shuffling sounded like someone sweeping the floor using a sapulidi. Search on Google if you don't know. It's spelled Sapulidi. I didn't think much of it until somebody whispered in Malay from my window. "I know you're alone in there." I immediately ran to my living room, and my parents came home around 2 to 3 minutes later. I told them what happened, and they said that there was no one outside. Keep this in mind, the sweeping sound carried on and only stopped when I heard my parents unlocking the gate. There were other disturbances, such as the typical marble sounds, hearing my furniture move on their own in the middle of the night, but as a kid, I just slept through it. However, my mother had the scariest encounter. She went out in the middle of the night to use the toilet, and when she went out to the living room, she saw me entering the toilet and the toilet lights were already on. She sat in our dining room table for about 5 minutes, and I was still inside the toilet. She started calling out for me from outside, but there was no response. She realized that the door wasn't closed properly and decided to take a peek. There was no one. After that incident, we made it a point not to leave our rooms after 10 p.m., but I find it weird that we didn't bother cleansing the house. After we moved, we no longer have any disturbances. However, one question remains in my mind. Is the whole Boonlay haunted? Or was it just my house? Or was it just the block? I guess the question will remain unanswered. The Bedok Auntie, Singapore Horror Story. This incident took place a few years back in the Bedok area. I don't want to disclose the area because this incident is probably a one-time thing, and I don't want to attract unnecessary attention, you could say. I still live in the same house now, but after all these years, the area still feels off sometimes. When I'm going home in the wee hours, there'll still be people loitering around my area, but I've always had this feeling of somebody following me back. But one particular incident proved my assumptions. I was going home around 10 p.m. after my football training in secondary school. I didn't feel anything off at all, but there was fewer people hanging around in general as usual. Surprisingly, I enjoyed the peace, and I didn't feel scared at all. When I reached my deck, around 50 meters away from the lift, this Malay auntie stopped me. She looked normal, hunchbacked, a tudung covering her head, and had no teeth or dentures. She asked me, "Do you live here?" in Malay. I nodded my head and she smiled. "Do you need my company?" she continued. I shook my head and apologized to her. I made an excuse of needing to rush home and just left her there. When I left her, I could hear her feet shuffling. I tilted my head a little and saw her walking with tiny steps tailing me from behind. I continued to take glances and I realized that her shuffling pace increased. I didn't think twice and ran to the lift, and luck was on my side. The lift was on the 1st floor. I got in, pressed the 4th floor, and I was on my way. When I reached my level, I still heard the shuffling sound, and out of curiosity, I looked down the staircase. I saw the same Malay auntie making her way up, and she was already on the 2nd floor. How did she walk that fast? At that point in time, I knew something was off, and I quickly went inside my house. Thankfully, my parents were still awake and I told them what happened. They asked me to recite some prayers and forced me to take a shower immediately. When I thought that everything was over, the disturbance continued. When I was about to fall asleep, I heard the same shuffling noise in the corridor outside my room window. I covered my ears and my face, but the fear stayed inside. In the end, I slept in my parents' room. Thankfully, after that day, I no longer see that auntie, and I heard that shuffling noise ever again. Since I still stay here now, I made it a habit to blast my music and brisk walk home from the bus stop every single time without fail. Anyone from Badak have any similar experience? Clementi Woods Park, Pekong. Everyone in Asia will be familiar with the term Pekong, or what many of us refer to as Gula Gula. What if I told you it doesn't sound like what you expect it to be? We usually associate Pekong to a ghost wrapped in white cloth and jumping from one place to another, but it's wrong. It's usually covered in filthy cloth with zero hint of whiteness, and it's floating instead of jumping. Back in 2012, if I remember correctly, I had 2 separate incidents and encounterings with this Pekong. The first incident took place during my friend's gathering. There was around 5 of us and we were chilling in this hut, you could call it, gossiping and laughing. The typical teenager stuff. It was getting late and there wasn't as many people, but we stayed up until the late hours. Nothing supernatural happened until we took a selfie. The first picture we took looks normal, but the second picture, the Pekong was in the frame. At first glance, you might not suspect it as a Pekong, as it just looks like a brown spot. But upon closer inspection, we realized that there were slight facial features. The scariest part was that the Pekong was about 8 to 10 meters behind us, floating beside a street lamp. None of us said anything because we didn't want to, quote-unquote, alert the Pekong. I mean, most of our parents usually remind us not to acknowledge its presence because it's similar to inviting it over. But one of my dumbass friends says, "Hey, look, got something, say, like a Pekong, haha." When he said that, there was a quick gush of wind and a foul smell. A better way to describe the smell is rotten eggs. Already uneasy, all of us stood up and made our way to the nearby HDB block to Lapak, and there, instead, we sat. Nobody opened up about that experience, and we all deleted our pictures, even the ones without the Pekong. Luckily, none of us had any disturbances that night. The second incident took place a few months later. I could still remember the Pekong incident vividly, but I still made the decision to go for a late-night run. I was actually going through a tough time and really needed some fresh air. I had no intentions to run into the Clementi Woods Park, but somehow I ran and appeared there. There were a few other joggers, so I wasn't that scared, but there are times where I appear to be alone. Everything was fine until I ran past this playground in the park. The Pekong was playing peekaboo with me. As I ran past, the same-looking Pekong peeked out from the back of a pole at the playground. I sped up and felt like my stamina was back at full tank. As I was making my way out, the Pekong appeared 2 more times, once behind a tree and one more time behind some bushes. I knew my eyes weren't playing tricks on me, but luckily I managed to reach home safe. Again, there were no disturbances at home, but I really couldn't sleep that night. And this is the first time I'm sharing this story, really. Thankfully, the Pekong doesn't follow people home, and I wonder if there's other people who have similar stories regarding the Pekong. Now, I still live in the West, but I made it to a point to never visit that place again. Sometimes when I really have to drive past that area, I still get the chills and I always feel somebody peeking at me. Singapore Annabelle. Back in June of 2014, there were images of this doll known as the Hyugang doll, and it was circulating around the internet. Mostly on Reddit and Twitter. You could search the image of the doll on Google, but I couldn't place it in the blog due to the copyright. It was found in a pretty bad condition and lying on a tree with Bismillah, which translates to "in the name of Allah" in Arabic, written on the cloth and covering its eyes. The cloth with that writing was believed to trap whatever jinn or evil entity inside the doll. Many was warned against removing the blindfold, but a few days later the doll was missing and believed to be taken by someone else. There were many speculations on the doll. The doll was said to be moving around in the house on its own when the owner wasn't around, and sometimes a female voice could be heard from the doll when it's left alone in a room. Some also say it's a Malay female voice. Not a gecko. When they entered the room, the head of the doll will be facing a different direction as well. They believe that the only way of getting rid of the doll was to place it far away from home with the cloth covering its eyes. On the same day, there was a reported murder case as well as a suicide case. While some say it's a coincidence, others believed otherwise. While there was no definitive evidence to this case, it's still quite creepy if you ask me. The features of this doll are the most contributing factor. Sometimes I wonder whether the whole thing was just a setup or a prank, and at the same time, who in their right mind would leave a haunted doll on the side of a road below a tree? Army outfield disturbance. This happened around 1 to 2 a.m. when I had to do my prowling with my buddy at that time. We were supposed to do our rounds in a circle, but we got lazy, so we decided to create our own route, which only involved us walking to the latrine and then walking back to the starting point. It was a straight route. Everyone was asleep, including our sergeants, and to be very honest, I was so tired that fear didn't even enter my mind. Everything was going well until our third round, when I had to use the latrine. I was damn Backup 1. I could literally shit anywhere, unlike my other platoon mates who held their shit until we came back to our company. So I was doing my business peacefully, and my buddy was rushing me. "Faster, Lay." He repeated this every 1 minute for real. After a while, he stopped, and I was so relieved because the shit as well as the silence. When I was cleaning up after myself, my friend spoke again. "Finish already?" I walked out of the latrine, and guess what? My friend was just staring at me blankly, as if he saw a ghost. I told him to stop fooling around since it really wasn't the right time. He whispered to me, "Let's stop patrolling. Let's just go to bed." Even though I was back up, I would never go against the rules because I wanted to keep my records clean, you know? I told him no, but he was legit getting pale. Then he said to me, "I swear I saw a head continuously peeking out of the latrine area when you were inside, and I know it wasn't you because it wasn't wearing our uniform." I finally realized the reason he asked me to go faster. After hearing that, I quickly turned to face the latrine, and what I saw creeped me out. So in order for us to navigate the latrine, glow sticks were placed around the area. What I saw was the glow sticks sliding along the string back and forth at a constant speed. No such animal could do that, and if there was an animal, we could clearly see it, but it was clear that there was nothing there since we were only 5 to 10 meters away. There was no wind either. We went straight to the HQ area and woke up one of the commanders. After telling them what we encountered, he just told us to go to sleep and not to tell anyone anything. That night I didn't get to sleep at all, and being in a confined sort of shell scrape made it worse. Thankfully, it was the last night there. I'm too lazy to type out the full encounters of my friends, but I'll just share some of their encounters. One of my friends said that he heard the Muslim call for prayer at 12 a.m., which doesn't make sense since it's not the time for Muslims to pray. and we were pretty sure that there's no mosques in that area. Another one of my friends claimed that he heard children giggling during their taking cover exercise, which happened around 7 or 8 p.m. The last disturbance was the sound of bells following my friend. He was doing his patrolling a few hours after me, but he was doing his patrol alone at one point, as his buddy also had to use the latrine. He said that he didn't see anything, but when he was walking around, he heard this constant bell sound following from behind, and judging from the loudness of the sound, he said it was almost directly behind him. Grandma is still alive. Some backstory. There's a family of 5 staying together: parents, 2 siblings, and my grandma. So my grandma has been staying with my aunt and cousins for a while before she passed on. On the day she passed, the whole family came down and everybody was greatly affected. My grandma was one of the nicest people in the world, and she took care of all of us equally. I frequently visited my aunt's house just to meet my grandma, and she would constantly give me pocket money and cook for me even though she was not well herself. However, it affected my cousins the most, since they've been staying with the grandma since birth, and at that point in time, they were around 12 years old and 9. After that day, my aunt realized that her younger daughter started spending less time with the family and locked herself in her room more often. Let's call my older cousin P and my younger cousin Q to make it easier. My aunt started to become suspicious of Q and thought that she had a boyfriend, so she decided to ask P to be her spy. The next day, P told my aunt that Q claimed to be talking to Grandma. She asked P to keep it as a secret. After my aunt told her husband about this, Q received a very bad scolding, and they reinforced that Grandma was no longer around. From that day onward, she was forced to leave the door open, and P was forced to sleep in the room with her. A few days went on and nothing happened. However, about a week later, weird things started happening again. P claimed that Q started creeping out of the room slowly and started talking to Grandma in the kitchen again. She informed her mom again, but this time, instead of confronting her, my aunt and her husband decided to eavesdrop on the conversation. Initially, they thought that Q was developing mental issues like depression, but when they eavesdropped the conversation, they knew something wasn't right. Q was giggling the whole time while talking to Grandma. The conversation also sounded real. They talked about what she ate, what she did in school, and her problems. They eavesdropped for a few nights, and one day they decided to take action. When they stepped into the kitchen, what they really saw proved to them that Q needed professional help. In Q's hands was raw chicken meat, and she was reaching across the dining room table as if she's feeding someone. My aunt screamed and Q was startled. I wasn't there to witness this, but I can imagine how bad it was. P told me that Q started crying and asked, "Where'd Nenek go?" I forgot what happened next, but the next morning my uncle brought Ustaz over to help out. Ustaz is like a Muslim version of a priest, for those who don't know. The Ustaz came and Q immediately acted weird. She wasn't possessed or anything, but she kept on asking why the Ustaz came and said that she didn't like it. When the Ustaz started reading some Quranic verses, Q started shouting in Malay, "Stop, Nenek is in pain." No one else saw Nenek except for Q. Also, we Muslims do not believe in spirits of the dead, meaning once you passed on, you'll go to afterlife and you won't come back as spirits. The Ustaz asked my aunt whether she kept any items that Grandma left behind. That's when my aunt realized Q kept the dress or maybe pajamas that Grandma wore on the day she passed, and to be honest, it was filthy. They took the dress and passed it to the Ustaz when the uncle went to help Q in his arms, since she was getting restless and wanted to stop my aunt. The Ustaz placed the dress in a bucket of water that had Quranic verses read into it, something like holy water. The Eustas explained that the filthy clothes attracted certain jinns, also known as demons, and it took the form of Grandma. The jinn took advantage of Q's emotional state to use her. After the whole ritual, the dress was disposed of, and Q was quite affected by the whole thing. Eventually, she became better, and now she's back to normal. Personally, I don't find this story scary, but I thought that it was a good story to share. I find this story more sad. Sad because the love of all of us had for our grandma, and especially Q. I know a lot of us still miss Grandma, but we all know that she's in a better place. Palau Ubin Kids. Have you heard of OBS, Outward Bound Singapore Camp? Almost every secondary school student would have gone to this camp, and this incident happened to me so many years back. Back then I was 15 and my group was one of the groups that had to go to the Palau Ubin for the most part. There was another group, but they stayed on the mainland. Boring, in my opinion. I wouldn't say that the campsites there are run down, but the atmosphere there was definitely different. While it's surrounded by beautiful nature, it was somewhat spooky, especially at night. The main campsite was the best because it was the most modernized. However, there was another campsite that was quite bad. I forgot the name of the campsite, but I remembered my group kayak to that campsite. So, in the other campsite, we slept in the middle of this forested area in our tents, and our kayaks were placed at one corner. There were no toilets, and we had to do our business in the dark with only 1 or 2 glow sticks lighting up the area. Thankfully, we had to sleep there for only one night. That night, I didn't even bother cleaning myself up. I went straight to bed. I was too shagged out because my group had a lot of girls and some useless guys. Being the only bigger-sized dude, I was tasked to carry all the heavy jerry cans around. Little did I know going to bed straight wasn't the best decision. In the middle of the night, I had to take a piss, and I was the type that you can't really hold. So when I woke up, the other guys were in deep sleep, and I wasn't the scared type, so I decided to walk out alone. Let me tell you this. The outside was so dark, and the moon barely did anything to light up the area. I used my torch to make my way to the makeshift toilet, quote-unquote. Everything went smoothly. When I was peeing, that's when I heard children laughing. I almost shit my pants because who in their right mind would be playing in the middle of the night? Also, it couldn't be any of them at the campsite because it was giggling of a toddler, not somebody who's 15. There was no way it was a prank as well, as all of our phones were confiscated. After the giggling, it was followed by the sounds of bushes rustling. I don't know why, but my instant reaction was to shine my torch in that direction. Guess what I saw? I saw 3 kids running away from me into the forested area. Why do I say running, you may wonder? They had legs, but none of their legs were touching the ground. They were, quote-unquote, running with their legs about 4 to 5 inches above the ground. I ran back to my tent, covered my face with my sleeping bag. Eventually, I went back to sleep despite being scared. I kept this to myself and only shared it with my friends after the whole OBS camp ended. When I went back home, I searched online and found out that there were other similar incidents where they all saw kids roaming around. That's all that happens to me and my friends, which I'll submit when I'm free too. Hope this story is scary enough to be featured. Well, it was here. And that's the end of today's stories, and please forgive me for any pronunciations of anything in Malay. I'll work on it. Have a good night. See ya.